The brutal truth about World War II flak gun crews. There is a photograph taken somewhere over the Ruhr Valley in 1943. A B-17 Flying Fortress, wings level, smoke trailing from two engines, surrounded by what looks like a sky filled with black flowers. Those flowers are 88mm shells detonating at altitude. Each one carries enough force to fold a wing, to punch through an aluminum fuselage, to kill 10 men before any of them had time to register what had happened. What the photograph doesn't show is the other side of that exchange. The men on the ground making it happen. At several thousand feet below that bomber stream, crews were standing at gun stations, cranking elevation wheels, calling out corrections, feeding shells into breaches as fast as their arms could move. But listen to this. These were not soldiers in the conventional sense. By the middle years of the war, the flak batteries were staffed by teenagers pulled from the Hitler Youth, by factory workers in their 50s and 60s, and in some positions, by women. And for the better part of 4 years, that force, assembled from whoever was available, was killing Allied airmen at a rate that genuinely alarmed Allied command, because no one had produced a satisfactory answer to what Germany had constructed. The flak arm killed more Allied airmen than German fighter pilots ever did. That fact tends to get lost in the standard history of the air war, where fighter duels and aces dominate the popular account. But the documented loss records from the strategic bombing campaign over Europe are clear on the point. Ground-based anti-aircraft artillery, not aerial combat, was the primary cause of Allied heavy bomber losses across the full arc of the war. The German word Flak is an abbreviation of Flugabwehrkanone, aircraft defense cannon. Germany had been developing dedicated anti-aircraft artillery doctrine since the First World War, when aircraft flew low and slow enough that ground fire was a credible threat. By the 1930s, that tradition had produced the weapon that would define the category, the 8.8 centimeter Flak 18, later refined into the Flak 36 and Flak 37. The 88 is widely remembered as an anti-tank weapon, used to devastating effect by Rommel in North Africa. But its original design intent was to put high explosive shells into aircraft flying between 10,000 and 30,000 feet. The shell weighed roughly 20 pounds. The gun could reach an altitude of 35,000 feet. A well-trained crew could fire 15 to 20 rounds per minute. But here's what the technical specifications don't capture. A single 88mm shell detonating within 30 feet of a bomber was close enough to destroy control surfaces, rupture fuel tanks, and kill crew members through fragmentation alone. A direct hit was not required. The gun crews were not aiming at aircraft in any direct sense. They were firing at a mathematical prediction, at the position a moving aircraft would occupy several seconds into the future, based on its current altitude, speed, and heading. That calculation was handled by instruments called Kommandogeräte, mechanical fire control computers that processed optical tracking data and produced firing solutions. The gun crews set fuses, loaded shells, and fired on command. The computation was someone else's responsibility. The crew's job was to execute the loading cycle continuously until the raid was over or the battery was hit, which happened with greater frequency than the historical record typically acknowledges. In 1939, Germany maintained roughly 2,600 heavy flak guns in its inventory. By the end of 1943, that number had grown to nearly 15,000. The expansion was driven by operational pressure from two directions. RAF Bomber Command's night offensive against German cities beginning in 1940, and the USAAF 8th Air Force's daylight precision bombing campaign launched in 1942. Both required a flak response that the existing network could not provide. But that's not all. Meeting that demand required one of the most significant industrial diversions of the entire war, and it is one of the least examined. By 1944, Germany was directing approximately 30% of all artillery production toward flak guns, not field artillery, not anti-tank weapons, but anti-aircraft guns. The ammunition to sustain them consumed another substantial share of industrial capacity. Estimates vary by source, but several analysts calculated that shooting down a single Allied bomber required between 1,200 and 1,588 mm shells on average, when accounting for total rounds fired against total aircraft destroyed across the full campaign. That ratio tells you something the photographs of burning bombers cannot. The flak arm was vast, it was expensive, and it required a continuous expenditure of material to sustain its kill rate. The question German command kept returning to, and never fully resolved, was whether the exchange was sustainable. The Allied airmen on the receiving end did not need a formal analysis to answer that question. Flak accounted for the majority of Allied bomber losses over Europe. For the men flying those missions, this was not a statistical abstraction. It was the constant, unpredictable reality of every approach to every target. At least a fighter you could see. By 1942, the flak arm was consuming manpower at a rate the Wehrmacht could not sustain from its standard military-age male pool. The front lines needed infantry. The factories needed labor. The flak batteries needed someone. It gets worse. What the military ultimately decided was to draw from categories it had not previously considered eligible for active service. The Luftwaffenhelfer program, formally established in 1943, conscripted boys as young as 15 into flak service. At peak mobilization, approximately 200,000 of these boys, called Flakhelfer, were serving in batteries across Germany. They attended school in the mornings when school was still operational. They stood gun watches in the afternoons and at night. They handled ammunition, operated range-finding equipment, and assisted with loading. Some operated the guns themselves. The youngest were 14 years old. Survivor accounts, and there are considerable numbers of them because these boys grew into old men who eventually documented what they had done, describe the specific character of that experience with a clarity that formal military history tends to skip past. One former Flakhelfer who began serving in a battery near Hamburg in 1943 at the age of 15 described his first real engagement. The sound of the incoming bomber stream before it was visible, the vibration of neighboring batteries opening fire, and the loading drill taking over with enough mechanical repetition that he did not think about what the shells were doing until afterward. He was told the following morning that they had hit an aircraft. It came down several miles away. He felt, he wrote, nothing he could name. Allied bomber crews could not suppress a flak battery from altitude with defensive armament. The waist guns, tail guns, and turrets carried on B-17S and B-24S were designed to counter fighter attacks. Against artillery fire, they were irrelevant. What bomber crews were ordered to do on the bomb run, the approach phase that could last 5 minutes or longer, was fly straight and level at a fixed altitude. But listen to this. Straight and level at a known altitude was precisely what flak fire control systems were designed to engage. A maneuvering aircraft was harder to predict. A steady aircraft on a bomb run was, within the limits of the instruments, solvable. When a battery acquired the correct firing solution, when fuse settings and elevation calculations aligned, the shell bursts would walk toward the formation in a pattern experienced crews learned to read and could do nothing about. Experienced aircrew described watching the pattern tighten across successive salvos and understanding what the convergence meant before the next rounds arrived. The casualty mechanics were specific. Fragmentation from an 88mm shell spread in a roughly spherical pattern, reaching lethal velocity within approximately 30 feet of detonation. Airframe, engines, fuel systems, and crew were all within that envelope simultaneously. Flak wounds were typically fragmentation injuries, irregular metal entering tissue at high velocity, often without clean wound geometry, frequently carrying fabric and aircraft material into the wound channel. Surgeons treating flak casualties described the injuries as among the most difficult they encountered, not because any individual wound was necessarily fatal, but because a crew member could absorb multiple small fragments across several wound sites, each survivable in isolation, collectively overwhelming. Some aircraft continued flying for minutes after losing crew members or major structural sections because the surviving crew in the rear of the fuselage did not immediately understand what had happened forward. The gun crews on the ground had no direct visibility into those outcomes. They knew the altitude data. They knew their rate of fire. They could sometimes confirm a hit through optical instruments, a change in an aircraft's attitude, a trail of smoke, a departure from the formation. But what the survivor accounts return to, consistently, is not the drama of a confirmed kill. It gets crazier than you'd expect. It's the grinding repetition. A heavy raid on a German industrial city might put a bomber stream 20 miles long over a given battery position for 30 to 40 minutes. During that window, a functional 88mm battery could expend between 300 and 500 rounds. The physical demands of that, continuous handling of 20-pound shells under the concussion of your own guns firing, in whatever weather the night or day had produced, were exhausting in ways the tactical narrative rarely acknowledges. The batteries in the Ruhr Valley, the industrial region RAF bomber command called Happy Valley, in the dark humor that developed among air crews, were under attack with sufficient frequency that gun crews operated in a state of effectively permanent readiness. Rest schedules existed on paper. The aircraft arrived on whatever timetable Allied planners determined, which the crews below could not anticipate. They waited. They stood watch. They slept when the operational tempo allowed it. Some batteries were mobile, mounted on railroad platforms that could be repositioned. Fixed installations had better instrument emplacements but were permanent targets. Periodically, Allied fighters would descend to strafe flak positions after a bombing mission, a practice the crews understood as a direct tactical response to what they were doing. Several accounts describe the low-level strafing attacks as producing a distinctly different quality of fear than the bombers overhead. The bombers were distant, and the threat was impersonal. A P-47 at 50 feet was neither. The effectiveness of the flak defense shifted across the war in ways that aggregate loss statistics only partially reflect. In the second half of 1943, USAAF daylight bombing losses approached levels that were operationally difficult to sustain. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission in August 1943 lost 60 heavy bombers in a single operation, 600 men killed or taken prisoner in one day. The second Schweinfurt raid in October 1943 produced the same number. Loss rates during those months approached 10% per mission across some periods. But the reason this is worth examining carefully, those losses were driven by a combination of fighter interception and flak, with fighters being the dominant cause in that specific phase of the campaign. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang as a long-range escort fighter in late 1943 and early 1944 substantially reduced the fighter threat. Luftwaffe interceptors that had previously been able to engage bomber formations without effective opposition found themselves countered by escort fighters with the range to cover missions to Berlin and back. The German fighter arm, which had been highly effective through 1943, was significantly degraded in capability by the summer of 1944. The flak presented a different problem entirely. Escort fighters could not suppress a ground-based artillery network. The guns were fixed in position. They would be there on the next raid, with the same fire control equipment and whatever crew remained to operate them. Allied losses attributed to flak increased as a proportion of total losses in 1944, in direct relation to the reduction of the fighter threat. What remained, once the interceptors had been largely neutralized, was almost entirely artillery. By that point, some crews had been operating their positions for 2 and 3 years. The survivors were not, as a group, the most capable. They were the ones who had not been killed. Survival in a flak battery involved competence, but it also involved a substantial element of chance. a bomb release from a formation that did not know the battery was there, a secondary explosion in the ammunition store, a strafing run on a day when the crew was exposed. The flak helfer who had entered service in 1943 at 15 years old was 17 by 1945, and the one still alive had been operating within that routine long enough that it constituted the primary structure of their daily existence. Several accounts describe former flak helfer visiting their old battery positions decades after the war and finding themselves physically rehearsing the loading drill from muscle memory. Some found that involuntary. None of them seemed to have been surprised by it. By late 1944, Allied bombing had degraded German fuel production severely enough that Luftwaffe fighters were being grounded for lack of aviation gasoline. The flak batteries, running on a separate supply chain, could still be supplied and remained operational. In the final winter of the war, the flak arm was, in some respects, the most continuously functional component of the German air defense system still in operation. But it gets worse. The contracting perimeter of German-held territory was concentrating those defenses into a smaller area, which meant that the batteries defending the remaining industrial targets were, in many cases, operating at their highest historical density, while the campaign they were resisting continued to grow in scale. The crews at those positions were, by any honest assessment, operating without a viable strategic purpose. The war's outcome had been determined. The industrial capacity they were defending was being methodically destroyed whether they fired or not. The Allied air forces were operating at a scale where attrition, even at loss rates that would have been considered serious in 1942, could no longer threaten the campaign's continuity. Some batteries ceased firing as the ground war approached from one direction, while the bomber streams continued arriving from another. Some crews left their positions and walked away from the war before it formally ended. Others kept firing until the ammunition was exhausted or the position was overrun by advancing Allied ground forces. The distinction between those two responses does not reflect cleanly on either group. The institutional framework those crews had been operating within had failed them in every concrete sense. What each individual decided still mattered within the wreckage of that framework is a question the accounts raise without answering. The flak helfer had never had a choice about any part of it. The older men managing the batteries had understood from some point in 1943 or 1944 that what their position did or did not do on any given night would not change the direction of the war. They kept operating their guns regardless, because the alternative was harder to act on than the routine the war had imposed. The post-war accounting of what the flak arm cost and what it achieved produced figures that surprised analysts who had lived through the campaign on both sides. Germany was producing approximately 2 million 88mm flak shells per month by 1944. Total Allied aircraft losses across the European theater's strategic bombing campaign are estimated at roughly 18,000. The portion attributable to flak versus fighter interception is debated by period and theater, but for 1944 and 1945, the evidence consistently supports flak as the primary cause. The reason this matters, when you calculate shells expended per aircraft destroyed across the full campaign, the numbers would have been considered unsustainable under any honest cost-benefit analysis. The German command knew this. Internal Luftwaffe planning documents acknowledged the unfavorable arithmetic directly. The shells were expensive. The guns and their associated instruments were expensive. The manpower, conscripted boys and older men pulled from other sectors of the economy, carried its own costs in labor and in the accelerated depletion of a demographic pool that was already under pressure from the demands of the ground war. What the flak arm provided that made those numbers politically tolerable was psychological. It imposed a cost on every bombing mission. It gave the German population visible evidence that the air defense of their cities was an active effort, not an absence. The sound of the guns firing during a raid carried a function beyond the purely tactical. Whether that function justified the expenditure is not a question the gun crews were asked to weigh. The decision had been made at levels well above a battery position. The crews loaded shells and fired them, and the accounting was done by people who never stood at a gun station. The men and boys who served in those batteries came home, the ones who came home at all, to a country that had been substantially destroyed by the campaign they had spent years trying to stop. The factories they had defended were largely rubble. The industrial capacity that had produced 2 million 88mm shells per month had been systematically dismantled. The cities their batteries had ringed were damaged to a degree that took decades to rebuild. The flak arm had been, by measurable technical standards, one of the most effective anti-aircraft systems ever deployed in warfare. But listen to this. It was deployed in defense of a war effort that was comprehensively and catastrophically defeated. Both of those things are simultaneously true, and the people who had operated those guns lived with that specific combination in a way that does not map to any straightforward historical verdict. The Allied airmen who had flown through those barrages and survived were not, for the most part, inclined to think carefully about the people below who had been firing at them. That is understandable and probably inevitable. But from the distance of the historical record, the crews on both sides of that exchange were operating within systems they had not designed, executing decisions made by others, and absorbing costs that planners at higher levels had determined were acceptable. The bombers continued arriving. The guns kept firing. Neither side had a mechanism to stop being what the war had made them until the war itself concluded. When it finally did, in the spring of 1945, in the operational silence that followed the last raid, the surviving Flakhelfer were 17 and 18 years old. Some of them had been doing this for 3 years. They were standing beside guns that no longer had anything to shoot at, in a country that no longer existed in the form they had been told they were defending. If this kind of history is what you come here for, the documented record behind the weapons, the crews, and the decisions that shaped the air war over Europe, a like and a subscription help more of it get made.